The history of the M1 service rifle is typically remembered as having been mainly written on the battlefields of World War II. When we think of its role during the conflict, we picture riflemen carrying the M1 through snow in northern Europe or across beaches of islands in the Pacific. Mass production during World War II is what made all of that possible, but that part of the M1's success story was years in the making, and getting there is a story in and of itself. To learn a little more about the rifle's early history, I've come here to Springfield Armory National Historic Site, where the M1 was born. And it just so happens that I'm here on the weekend of the 2019 GCA convention, so there's kind of a lot going on here at the moment. But first things first, right now, I have an appointment in the museum with Springfield Armory curator Alex McKenzie, and he's pulled some examples of the M1 that narrate the story of design development and early production. So follow me, this should be interesting. Now, Alex, in the past I described this M1 artifact as the Mona Lisa of M1s because of the significance of it being serial number 1. What do you find interesting about this one?
You know, it certainly has that aspect of being really important as the first M1 ever made, but you take it within the context of its manufacture. They're not quite there yet. We're in 1934. This is still a work in progress. They were working on not only making the design itself better, but one of their big priorities was using the manufacture of this and the other model shop Garands to figure out how to make these.
So we might have the greatest battle implement ever devised, but we haven't figured out how to mass produce it yet, have we?
Right.
And there's a long, drawn-out story that comes before this.
There sure is. You know, if you think about it, and you know, John Garand hired here in 1919. This is 1934, so there's 15 years of design and development and testing and competition, all sorts of stuff going on that leads up to this moment. And this isn't how it would have looked, you know, when it was made in 1934. Again, this was a test piece. They were working out details, as I said. So there are different parts swapped out, notably on the exterior. You know, that a little later front sight is not a model shop front sight. But also, one of the things I find fascinating that you can't see is the inside of the stock is completely charred because they were doing endurance testing and trying to figure out how well these designs in this configuration worked.
Even though there's so much that comes before this rifle and so much that comes after this rifle, it's still kind of fascinating and electric to be standing in the presence of serial number 1. May I hold it?
Sure.
Thank you. So now we're looking at serial number 81. Why is this an important M1?
Well, 81 is actually the first one manufactured off the factory floor. So whereas the first 80 model shop Garands are made in the model shop, and 81 is the first one to go through the system they designed to go through factory production. So it's really important in that it's the first one to go through what they hoped would ultimately be a mass production capability of this rifle.
This is reminding me to remember something important. That is that the genius of the man that designed this was not just the design innovation that went into making this a reality, but also the fact that he was able to design processes by which this could be mass produced.
Exactly.
So he could Henry Ford the M1 rifle in addition to designing it.
Right. And it also is a great illustration of, you know, what it takes to manufacture these in terms of going from raw materials to being issued to soldiers on the front. They didn't just make them and send them out the door. There were all sorts of tests and evaluations that they did in the middle of manufacturing and even at the end. So one of the distinctions of number 81 here is that it did not pass function firing and took a little while for it to get past the tests that would have happened when this was completely assembled as a rifle.
It makes the story of the M1 rifle more human in a way, because it wasn't just perfection from the start. It had its troubled time period, and 81 represents that nicely. Mass production, fails function fire, but then eventually it gets dragged through and it passes.
Yep.
But still, it doesn't do it immediately. It makes the M1 rifle look more, like as a character, it looks more believable and fallible and human. And I kind of like that about it. In the pantheon of M1 rifles, number 87 holds a special place, doesn't it?
Sure does. It's not a nice round number. Doesn't have a 1 or a 0 or anything like that, but it is a first. What makes 87 cool is that it's the first M1 to pass all function firing and all testing. It's the first to get its proof stamps and the first to be ready to go out the door.
In this way, 87's just as special as serial number 1. And we're well on the way now, so we can mass produce this, the greatest battle implement ever devised. But there's still a long way to go, because it's got all this up here. It's still a gas trap M1 rifle.
Sure is. But at least now you're starting to, this is the very beginnings of getting issuable rifles out in the hands, where of course you're, in a way, that's its next round of tests, in a way to see how it does in large numbers in the field. The folks here at the Armory, starting with Mr. Garand himself, was certainly very excited when this rifle came off the line and passed all tests.
And so we have to get to number 87 before we can get to the next important milestone, which is transition from gas trap to gas port.
Right.
We're still a long way away from replacing the gas trap system, but at least we're at the point now where we have a semi-automatic service rifle that can be mass produced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're in about July 1937 here. So this is actually the function firing target from serial number 87.
So this is a victory lap.
It absolutely is.
We finally have the world's greatest rifle and we can finally mass produce it.
Although not quite as well as they ended up doing in the future. They knew there was still work to do, but this was a huge, huge milestone. We don't have a lot in the archives here at Springfield Armory that have to do with the general production of Springfield Armory. A lot of that was taken with the Army or didn't get saved. But somewhat miraculously, we do have a set of drawings that was straight out of the model shop that has to do with that rehab, let's call it streamlining of production right after that initial manufacturing. So once, after serial number 87 was produced, maybe the following spring, they started saying, all right, how do we make this more efficient? We're gonna have to likely produce a lot of these in much higher numbers. What are efficiencies that we can look at, and what are some machines that we can update? I mean, a lot of their machines, they were still using stuff that they made the 1903 on. And a lot of those machines were losing their accuracy or not capable of making things at the tolerance they were looking for the M1. So they needed to do something. So beginning in the spring of 1938, they started looking at every single operation of every single component and laying it out. And in fact, we have some notes here, which I believe are in John Garand's own hand, where, for example, this is the gas cylinder. So operation by operation, written out. You can see where hand notes are saying layout of tooling. This is April of 1938. Modification to gas cylinder tooling layout, April of 1938. And so they're starting to make notes, analyze things. They even brought people in from the outside to help say, hey, what's the industry doing around the country, and who's doing the best, and how can we duplicate that here at Springfield Armory? So people from the outside are looking at this, people from internally are looking at this. So this is actually comments from John Garand on the gas cylinder plug. And he says, number one, in general, there seems to be possibilities for quite a few troubles to occur. So they're thinking strategically, they're thinking long term, and what are some of the hang-ups that we can see with the way we do things now, and how do we need to change? And so along with all these notes, we also have quite a few of these drawings that again get into nearly every single operation on every single piece. We don't have them completely here. These are actually more of the gas cylinder, but you can see they're making changes to tolerances, changes to measurements.
So this is not only just this fascinating story about the development of an extremely innovative shoulder arm, it's also a story about industrial mass production and how it's executed.
Yeah.
And these pieces of paper narrate the execution of industrial management.
It sure does.
And in a way, this is fascinating because so often we identify characteristics that define the American nation during the Second World War, and among the characteristics that we identify are things like competence and dedication to duty, and I'm seeing all of that in these papers. So this is serial number 179, and there are some interesting things going on with it. I was interested in it and asked you to pull it down, mainly because we wanted an example that could help us narrate the story of the 7th round stoppage and how it was ultimately repaired and how the rifles were modified. But then when we got it out and we started looking closely at it, that's when the fun really started. Because this rifle is not just modified for the 7th round stoppage. This started off as a very early mass production M1 that then goes through the whole system to the extent that it's carrying T105E1 rear sights. It went through a post-war rebuild. It's got this high-humped gas cylinder lock screw. It's got replacement wood, and the barrel's kind of the best part.
It sure is. Harrington and Richardson, dated January of 1952.
So it's kind of fun to see that the example we used to tell this one part of the early development story, this rifle takes us from the very beginning of M1 production all the way through Korea and really takes us to end of production in a way, because this rifle is around, because this 179 is made at one point in 1937?
Yeah. I mean, if number 87, I mean, this is only, another 90 or so, 92 off of number 87 we just looked at. But this one went on a little more of an adventure.
It sure
looks
did.
Like.
Now, Alex, this could have been the U.S. service rifle that fought the Second World War.
Almost. This one in particular is T3E2, serial number 2. And according to test records, they put this through an endurance trial in the fall of 1931. And what they did within the span of 55 minutes was put 1,400 rounds through it, and then cooled it off, cleaned it, and then fired another 760. So 2,160 rounds in the span of 55 minutes. And this thing passed with flying colors. The infantry board liked this rifle. And, but it's too bad within, 3-4 months of this wonderful test, they said not so much to the 276.
I still, in contemplating the T3E2, like to imagine it doing the fighting of the Second World War. I like to imagine GIs carrying these in their cartridge pouches and fighting their way uphill and down valley across Europe and islands in the Pacific.
Do you think it would have been any different?
That's just it, because part of me wants to imagine a world where this makes a significant difference, but I don't believe that that would have been the case. Nevertheless, it's fascinating to imagine Americans with a little bit lighter 10-shot semi-automatic rifle fighting World War II. This one has been personalized, and it seems like it's a little bit of a convoluted story too, because I'm seeing L Company 346th Infantry Regiment, and we have New Mexico. What else you got? Acorn, 87th Infantry Division, an American flag, V for Victory, God Bless America, the Combat Infantryman's Badge. He's got a little heart with an arrow through it.
Yeah, and probably best of all, we've got Claudia.
Claudia.
And so this stock has quite a story, and people here have done some research into it and been able to find it. It looks like there were multiple soldiers that put at least some aspect of their personal lives on here. But what kind of makes this interesting is that it's still a gas trap. This is number 2025, pretty early production.
Especially interesting considering that if the action belongs to this stock,
Right.
this is a rifle that was issued to troops in the field.
Yep.
Because the troops left their mark and narrate a little bit of story of this as a service rifle in action. And it never got any of the modified, so it's still a 22-inch long barrel gas trap M1, not modified for 7th round stoppage.
Mm-hmm.
And it happened. We know it happened. And this could be one of the rifles that it happened to.
Sure could. It looks like it came into the museum here about 1948, which is kind of interesting. And if you look at the unit history, they came into ETO in late '44. So if this was out there, this was all the way through the war, surviving in this configuration, if indeed these two are matched pieces.
This M1 presents every appearance of being garden variety, vanilla, and uninteresting. But there's a story, right?
There sure is. So this one was roughly October 1940 production. In theory, was one picked right off the line, picked by none other than John C. Garand, and handed over to show the president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the time, exactly what Springfield Armory was up to.
So at this stage of production, we have gotten past gas trap. So we're now a 24-inch gas port barrel. They've overcome the issue of the 7th round stoppage. Rifles are being modified, and rifles are now being produced without the problem that caused the 7th round stoppage. And so, in a way, this rifle gets us past the end point of our story. This is a rifle that represents perfectly what mass production of the gas port M1 rifle was during World War II.
And this one was really one of the beginnings of that, when Springfield Armory really had it. If you back up a little bit from this, July 1st, 1940 was the beginning of the Armory's fiscal year. And at that point, compared to the year previous, Springfield Armory's budget just went up by 250%. And so they were in the middle of making a totally new, modern manufacturing facility. It was one of the best in the country within 6 months of that. And all that hard work that Garand and his team had done up to that point was really about to pay off to the tune of more than 3.8 million of these being made through the end of the war, which at its peak is somewhere around 220 of these per hour that they were able to do, what's that, in early 1944 or so. So they had it down, they had it, and this is one of the first where you really get mass production.
I bought my first M1 rifle the day I turned 18 using my high school graduation money. That was in 1987. And in the 32 years since then, I've learned a lot about the rifle and a lot about the man who designed it. This visit to Springfield has been great for two reasons. First of all, because it's brought me into a closer appreciation for the time period stretching between 1919 and 1940, the time period that began when John Garand came to Springfield Armory to go to work and ends when the gas port M1 rifle goes into mass production here. It took a great deal of human effort, ingenuity, competence, and cooperation to bring the M1 rifle through those early years. And I can see that all now so much more clearly. The second reason that this particular visit to Springfield has been edifying is because it brought me here, to Hillcrest Park Cemetery, to the grave of the man who designed the world's first successful semi-automatic service rifle. This man who, in an analog era, overcame technical and bureaucratic challenges that would have stalled the lesser mind. This man came to Springfield 100 years ago and created something that we are still talking about today. And so it only seems fitting that we should end this story here at his grave with a moment of silence for John C. Garand. My name is Marty Morgan, and on behalf of the Garand Collectors Association, thank you for watching. The Garand Collectors Association was created to exchange information and expand knowledge of the U.S. rifle Caliber 30 M1, to preserve and publicize history of the rifle and its inventor, John C. Garand, to assist and encourage new collectors, to assist authors in writing new reference works, to assist members in their collecting, and to encourage competitive and recreational safe shooting of the rifle. GCA membership is inexpensive and brings useful benefits. Members receive the GCA Journal, a publication that presents invaluable technical and historical information about the M1 rifle. Membership also qualifies you to make purchases through the Civilian Marksmanship Program. To apply, simply visit thegca.org, where you can find a membership application form. You can even join online. It's well worth the low cost to join a community of people who collect and shoot the greatest battle implement ever devised.